Amen. So we're in this Advent series thinking about good news. The word in the Bible, gospel, means good news. It is an announcement. We've been thinking together over the last few weeks about the political nature of that announcement. The word gospel is a political term. It's only used in the Greek in political context. It has to do with an announcement of the inauguration of a king, or the victory of a king, or the imminent arrival of a king. And so when the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and really all of the scriptures announce the birth of Jesus, they use this word gospel to announce that a king has been born. It is a political reality. And so we've been thinking about how the good news is political. And we've defined political kind of at the macro level, the most simple level. Politics has to do with the use of power. How power is used. And so the gospel is an announcement of the use of power. God is exercising his power in the birth of Jesus. This is a move of God, by God, for God's purposes, that has incredible impact on our world. And so that's why Jesus went around announcing the good news. He would go from town to town, village to village, and he would call people and invite them, repent, because the kingdom of God is in your midst. It's right here. That what happened in the birth of Jesus created opportunity that hadn't been there before. Jesus opens a way to relationship with the Father. And so he invites us, and there are ramifications to that. The birth of Jesus was political. We looked a couple weeks ago at how the announcement of a king being born wasn't necessarily good news to the current king, right? That there are political ramifications of Jesus being king in the earthly sphere. This morning I want to continue to think through that, but I want to expand it, because God is not only the God of the earth, but he is the God of the heavens as well. And we've seen in our study of Genesis over the last decade, it's only been a year. It's been a little more than a year. But we've seen in our study through Genesis that our God, the Creator God, is the God of the heavens and the earth. That there is a spiritual realm and a physical realm. That God is the author and creator of both realms. That God not only created both realms, but filled both realms with his imagers. And we've seen in Genesis that there has been rebellion against God in the spiritual realm, and there's been rebellion against God in the earthly realm. And what I want to try to connect this morning in this Advent narrative is that the birth of Jesus is God's response to both rebellions. It's not just about what's happening on the earth. It's also about what's happened in the spiritual realm. That Jesus is the answer to everything. Somebody say amen this morning. Jesus is the answer to everything. So I want us to think about how the birth of Jesus is political. It's the use of God's power in the birth of Jesus. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2, 1-2 this morning. And let me just start by saying, please forgive me if I make you uncomfortable this morning by destroying some of our cultural narrative about the birth of Jesus that simply isn't in the biblical text. Can we do that okay this morning? Is that going to be all right? I'm going to do it anyway, so you might as well get on board. Here's this story. It starts out this way, and we know it, right? After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. Now, notice how it starts. After Jesus was born. So we're going to tell the story here in these couple of verses about the coming of the Magi, the wise men from the east who come and acknowledge and seek the one who was born King of the Jews. And it's amazing because we all have our mangers and our pictures, and we all create these like stable environments where Jesus is born. And so there we have the shepherds who came the night he was born, but we throw in the Magi. I have yet to see a manger scene that doesn't have the Magi. And how many do we have? We have 3, right? It doesn't say that in the text anywhere. It doesn't say there was 3. The reason we always put 3 is because there were 3 gifts. It might have been 1. Well, that's plural. So there might have been 2. There might have been 17. We don't know. What we do know is they weren't at the manger. Because this takes place when? After Jesus was born. So if you need to go home today and take the wise men out of your manger scene, yeah. You already forgave me. All right? Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. I find this so interesting. This is such an integral part of all of our Christmas narratives. We love the Star of Bethlehem. We love it. Silent Night's probably the greatest and most popular, most well-known. We sing about the stars. It's in the imagery. It's everywhere. Like we put lights on our trees to replicate stars. It's all there. We don't even think about the reality of the star being a part of Christmas. It's just, of course it is. But then if we stop and go, what was it? You go, I don't know, it's a star. Like, what was it? I don't know if you've been out, but there's a lot of stars. I don't know if you've really thought about this, but I want you to really think about this because something happened. This group of people, however many there were, that dwelled in a far-off land, beheld something in the night sky. They saw something. And let me tell you what they didn't see. They didn't see the appearance of a new star that hadn't been there before. We have records from that time, from astronomers, from all over the world, and that didn't happen. Something, though, happened, something that was read in the star by these magi led them to the conclusion that someone was born that was the King of the Jews, to the point that they make a dangerous and expensive journey to come and seek him out. We love that happened, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what it was and what that actually means. I'd like to do that together this morning. And to do that, we've really got to think about, who are these guys? What did they see? What did they think that it meant? How does that work? And how does it fit in to the biblical narrative overall? Well, the wise men or magi came, I believe, from Babylon. In the Greek text, the word magos is used. So magus is singular, magi is plural. So we know there was more than one. They come from the east where Babylon was. In order for us to understand why they would come upon seeing something in the heavens, we need to understand a little bit of who they were. This is going to drive me crazy. I'm going to keep going, though. Babylon is well known to anyone that has studied the Hebrew Scriptures. It is a symbol throughout the Hebrew Scriptures of a city that is raised in defiance of God. It becomes a symbol of human rebellion and human evil. Babylon is used by God as an instrument of punishment and discipline against God's people, the nation of Israel. Much of the Hebrew narrative involves the city and the nation and the empire of Babylon. When God destroys the nation and levels the city of Jerusalem, he uses the Babylonian Empire to do it. He takes the cream of the crop, the elite of the Jewish people, and they are taken out of Israel and transported to Babylon. This is where we encounter Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is where we see so many of the great stories and narratives in the Hebrew Scriptures that we love. This is all centered in Babylon. Now, at the time of Jesus, Babylon was in significant decline. After Babylon destroyed and ransacked Israel, eventually Babylon itself was destroyed and ransacked by the Persians. The Persians were then destroyed by a guy that we call Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was this small king from Greece that came and overtook the largest empire at the time in the history of history. Alexander the Great, when he started winning against the Persians, the Babylonians were very politically minded. They saw what was going to come. They knew that Alexander was going to defeat the Persians, so they sent an envoy to him and they surrendered Babylon to him. They had a great relationship with him, actually, at the beginning. Alexander was going to make Babylon their new headquarters. It was going to make Babylon his new capital. Started out well, didn't finish well because the Babylonians were diviners. They studied the stars meticulously. And they believed that they could interpret events through the movements of the stars. They did this with Alexander and discovered that he was going to die. They told him that the stars said he was going to die, and then guess what? He died. This was the introduction of the Magi, the Babylonian Magi, to the entire Greek world, and they were held in incredibly high respect because they predicted with incredible accuracy that Alexander was going to die. When he died, his kingdom gets split up and staggered in this political chaos, and Babylon is in the midst of it. You fast forward a century, another empire, the Parthian Empire, has come onto the scene, and they control Babylon. And Babylon has been diminished and diminished and diminished. A new city was built 60-some miles to the north, and it was growing and growing and growing, and Babylon was diminishing and diminishing and diminishing. But the Magi and the priests, they still were centered in Babylon, and they were still studying the stars. They studied it meticulously. When we think about the study of the stars, we think of the zodiac. We think of the astrology and the papers, and we're thinking mostly of Greek and Roman astrology. The divination of the Babylonians was much different. Now, they studied the same stars. And they had many of the same constellations. They had different names and different attributes and different designations. But they looked at it differently. The Romans and the Greeks practiced the study of the stars primarily connected to the day of a person's birth. Right? So that's where we get the horoscopes, right? Horoscopes comes from two words, horo meaning time, and scope meaning what is seen. And so the whole concept of Roman astrology, you say, okay, what day were you born? Okay, what was happening in the sky? That's going to determine who you are, what your personality is like, what's going to happen. And you can develop this rather subjective description of who you are and what's going to happen to you based on when you were born and what the stars were aligned. And people still do this today. Right? That is not what the Babylonian Magi did. They weren't concerned with that. In fact, the Babylonian Magi weren't concerned with how the stars reflected to individuals. They were concerned with how the stars reflected to kingdoms, and if it was to an individual, it was to kings. They saw the message of the stars through a political lens. That's how they interpreted it. They didn't care what the stars said about some shepherd or a carpenter or a fisherman. They cared what the stars would indicate about kingdoms and kings. And they knew the sky very, very well. In one sense, we say, oh, they lived so long ago. They didn't know what stars were, right? They didn't even know the difference between stars and planets, right? Now, they saw the planets, they described them, they tracked the movements. They called planets wandering stars. That's actually what the word planet means, wandering star. All the other stars, they stay in place, they twinkle. But the wandering stars, they would move. They're different. They studied these, they tracked these. Now, there's very practical reasons that they did this. Navigation at the time, GPS wasn't available, right? Just a constant blackout, right? No connection. The navigation was done by observing and studying the movement of the stars, and they were masters of this. We have hundreds and thousands of cuneiform tablets from the Babylonian Empire detailing every precise movement of the stars and the planets. They were very well aware with how the night sky functioned. Details, precision, and they tracked it. They recorded their observations. It's interesting, I found this ironic. We know more about the Babylonian Magi from the 3rd century BC than we do from the 1st century BC, because in the 3rd century, they were using cuneiform tablets, right? Everything was chiseled in. But then papyrus was discovered. It was cheaper and easier to start writing things down on papyrus. The only thing is, cuneiform tablets have a way better shelf life than papyrus. So we've got more records from the 3rd century Magi than we do from the 1st century. Isn't that weird? But it's kind of cool. The Magi kept these detailed descriptions and calculations of how the stars moved, and they had a comprehensive, detailed analysis of what each one meant. Modern horoscopes don't do that. They're not detailed. They're not precise. They're subjective. That's not how the Babylonians did. They had a book. Well, they had a collection of books. And books were named after the opening sentence. The divination manual of the Babylonians was called the Enuma, Anu, Enlil. It was very straightforward. It would describe something that happened in the sky, and then it would give a very specific meaning to that happening. That's how this worked. We have much of this. We don't have all of it. But what we have allows us to think and to see like they would think and see as they were interpreting the skies. Okay? Does that make sense? In other words, in order to understand why the Magi would come, we got to think like the Magi thought. We got to interpret it the way that they would interpret it. And it's actually pretty straightforward. In September of 3 BC, they witnessed something that was fairly common, not incredibly rare. Jupiter, the king planet, passed in front of Regulus. Yeah, you better bring me that, Denny. Regulus is the king star. The king star is in what constellation? Any ideas? You got 1 in 12 shots. Leo. The king star is in the king constellation. So Jupiter, the king planet, passes in front of Regulus, the king star, which is in Leo, the king constellation. We say, oh, that certainly must mean the birth of a king. Not at all. No, that's not what it meant to the Babylonians. Not at all. Do you know what it meant? It meant that the king of Akkad, which is the ancient name for Babylon, would die. That's what it meant. So here they are, September 3 BC. They look up, they see Jupiter moving, and Jupiter moves because it's moving around the sun as we are. We're not moving at the same speed, and we're not moving the same circumference. So there's times, actually, when Jupiter goes into retrograde, it looks like Jupiter's actually moving a different direction. That's just because we've passed it in a way. It's moving. And so what happens is it moves in a different direction, and then it turns back, and then it turns back. It's a very interesting phenomenon. You can watch it today. And in the Babylonian Manual of Divination, when that happens, it is a clear sign that the king of Babylon is going to die. Babylon at the time is ruled by the Parthians, so they interpreted this very simply, that there's going to be a major regime change. Then, in June of 12 BC, Jupiter went into conjunction with Venus. It's actually happening right now. Every 800 years or so, you get a super conjunction. And more frequently, you get a conjunction. A conjunction just means two of the planets start to line up. Super conjunction, they line up so much that it absolutely looks like one planet. It's actually happening right now. It's fun. So they saw this happen. And again, doesn't mean that a king is going to be born. It means, again, that the king of Babylon is going to die. But here's what's interesting. The first conjunction, or the first passing of Jupiter in front of Regulus, and then the conjunction take place exactly 9 months apart. So you got to try to put yourself in these Babylonian magi's mindset. They look and they see this sign. He's going to die. 9 months exactly later, same sign, a different sign, same meaning. The king's going to die. 9 months apart. Where did it take place? Well, it took place in the west, or in the land of Amuru, which is the land of Israel. So here's what they're seeing. The king is going to die. The other thing that the divination manual says is that an emissary needs to be sent to the enemy seeking peace. So here's these ancient Babylonian magi. They don't worship God. They don't worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They worship Babylonian gods. They're not relying on what we would call Old Testament prophecy. There's no Old Testament prophecy about this conjunction. They're studying the stars as Gentiles. And they read it and they say, oh, you know what's going to happen? Our king's going to die, and a new king from the west is going to come, so we better send somebody to make peace with him before he comes. What do they think is going on? They think a new Alexander the Great is coming. And so they discover this. Our king's going to die. 9 months later, the same thing happens. They put two and two together. They say, there's certainly going to be a king born in the west. Where is west? It's that way. Let's follow. So they follow. They follow Jupiter. They follow detail. And here's the thing, y'all. If you want to nerd out, and you want to spend some money, you can buy programs on your computer that will track the stars. And you can enter in any date. And it will show you from any place in the world what the sky looked like. You can go back and you can track this. And you can follow from these dates. You work it back. You can see where Jupiter would have been and how it would have led them from Babylon to Jerusalem to Bethlehem. This is fascinating stuff. By pagans. Let that set in. So they come. They come looking for this new king that's going to come and destroy their king. It's fascinating. You say, but wait, isn't divination forbidden? Didn't God say not to do that? You're right, he did. Deuteronomy chapter 18. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his sons or his daughter as an offering. All the children sigh with relief. There shall not be anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead. These are the religious practices of the nations that Israel is to drive out and dispossess as they possess the land. And God says, you shall not take on the religious practices of these other nations. God says that's not how you determine and discover truth. So very clear, God doesn't want his people to do that. Right? He says, whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. Because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations, which you are about to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this. That's about as clear as you can make it, right? Like God's not left much ambiguity there. No, you're not supposed to practice divination. That's true. That does not mean in any way, shape, or form that the sky is not a canvas for God to communicate with. Understand that. Understand that. It's important to understand. The fact that God tells them not to practice divination does not mean that divination is always false. You with me here this morning? Does not mean that God is not communicating through the stars, because in fact, God is communicating through the stars. We saw this right in Genesis chapter 1, in that great creation poem. When God creates the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, listen to what verse 14 says. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, for days, and for years. In the creation narrative, when God creates these heavenly bodies, the ancient people didn't know that they were giant balls of gas. They didn't know that there were planets out there rotating. They didn't know that, but this is what they knew, that God was the creator of all those things, and that God had orchestrated and organized his creation in a way that it proclaimed something, and that the movement and placement of those stars was designed by God to be signs. Are you with me? This is cool. So we get to Psalm 19, very well-known psalm. It starts out this way. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies above proclaim his handiwork. The psalm starts out by saying that the very existence of the heavens and the way that they function and the way that they move has a purpose, that their existence, that they declare the glory of God, and that they proclaim his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. You hear what the psalmist is saying? He says, there is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. In other words, there's no people, there's no place that don't observe and hear the voice of the stars, the voice of the heavens, the signs that God has placed in the heavens. Their voice, some of your translations may say their line. Their line, the elliptical line that astronomers and observers of the stars have. It's the movement of the planets and the sun, the constellations. Their voice, their line goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. And you might say, well, yeah, that's just general revelation. The existence of creation speaks that there's a creator. It had to come from somewhere. Yes, it means that, but it means more. At least to the Apostle Paul. To the Apostle Paul, this meant something significant. Let's go to Romans chapter 10. In what's undoubtedly Paul's greatest work, the letter to the church in Rome. In chapter 10, we find this beautiful line of logic and argumentation about how to proclaim the good news, the gospel of Jesus the King. And listen to what Paul says. The scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. There's no distinction between Jews and Greeks, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. Somebody say amen. Right, this is the good news. Jesus is king. He's the Lord. He's not just the king of the Jews. He's the king of kings. He's the king of all. And there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how will they believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? So this is he lays out his argument. He says, anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But he says, well, how are they going to call on him if they haven't believed in him? And how are they going to believe in him if they haven't heard of him? And how are they going to hear of him if somebody doesn't go and preach about him? We go, yeah, Paul, that's tight logic. That's good. He says, and how are they going to preach if they're not sent? So as it is written, how beautiful of the feet are of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So, it's not as simple as, well, you send somebody to preach, they preach, everybody believes. That's not that simple. It's not even close to that simple. And then he says, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. And then it gets weird. You ready? But I ask you, have they not heard? Now, just think about this. He starts by saying, the gospel says, anyone, whether Jew or Gentile, if they call upon the name of the Lord, they will be saved. And then he says, well, how will they call if they haven't believed? How will they believe if they haven't heard? How will they hear unless somebody preaches? How will somebody preach unless they're sent? And he goes, but have they not heard? And we would go, well, no, they haven't heard. Right? That's what you would assume Paul would say next, isn't it? No, they haven't heard. They haven't heard the announcement. And Paul says, indeed they have. And what does he do next? He quotes from Psalm 19. He says, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Let that sink in. Paul is saying that God has been preaching his own gospel, not just through human mouthpiece, but God has been preaching the announcement of Jesus in the skies. How do we know that's true? Well, one, the wise men showed up. And two, at least according to John, the Apostle John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, John the Revelator, who wrote that weird and wacky book of Revelation, actually tells us exactly what the Babylonian Magi saw and how the voice of the stars proclaimed the birth of Jesus. You want to see it?
Revelation 12, and a great sign. Okay, so we already know. We're not, what's going to come next in chapter 12 is it's not a narrative of things that actually happened. It's a sign of things that are happening. You with me? And where do signs appear? In the heavens. A great sign appeared in the heavens. A woman, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So it starts out. Here's this sign in the heavens. There's a woman. She's pregnant. What's the constellation of a woman associated with fertility and pregnancy? It's constellation Virgo. Okay. Clothed with the sun. That's in astronomical language. That means that the sun is in the constellation Virgo. As the ecliptic moves and the constellations rotate, the sun is in different constellations. So for the sun to be in the midst of this woman, the sun is located in the constellation Virgo. That happens every year for approximately 20 days. All right? But it's a little bit more detailed with that. The sun is in the moon, or the sun is in Virgo, and the moon is at her feet. So 20 days out of the year, the sun is in the constellation Virgo. And when the moon is directly at her feet, that narrows down from 20 days to a 90-minute period. We look back, we say, when did that happen around the time of Jesus' birth? Any guesses? I mean, it's 1 in 365. Let me tell you when it wasn't. It wasn't December 25th. September 11th, 3 BC. Oh, there's more. Now, she's got a crown. The crown is Leo. When this happened on September 11th, you've got the sun right in the middle of Virgo. The moon is at her feet, and right above her is Leo, the lion, the king, as her crown. Interestingly enough, on September 11th, Jupiter, the king planet, was passing Regulus, the king star, in Leo. So what the Babylonian divination manual interpreted as the death of a king, there's more going on, and it's the announcement of the birth of a king. This is unbelievable. She's pregnant, was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in the heavens. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. On his head were 7 diadems. And the dragon, the red color, locates it in the southern sky. There's 2, maybe 3 possibilities about which constellation this refers to. I think it probably refers to Hydra, because immediately above Hydra are Corax, the raven, and Crater, which each have 7 and 10 stars respectively. So we've got in this moment, and again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can get on these star astronomy programs, you can backtrack it to that day, and this is what you'll see. You will see the sun in the midst of Virgo, the moon at the feet, Leo above. You will see Hydra in the southern sky, his tail sweeping into the void, a large area where there are no stars. That factors in here. Above the 10 and the 7, this is amazing stuff. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. It's fascinating. I hear people all the time talk about the fall and the fall of Satan, and that at the fall of Satan, back either before Eden or right with Eden or right after Eden, that he fell and 1/3 of his angels went with him. And we say, well, yeah, that happened in Eden, so that, like it happened in Genesis, but Genesis doesn't say that. at all. And it didn't happen then because it happened here. And this is not describing Eden in the creation. This is describing what? The birth of Jesus. And so at the birth of Jesus, there's not only political turmoil on the earthly sphere, but at the birth of Jesus, there's a massive conflict and warfare in the heavenlies. And that the birth of Jesus was the decisive victory of God against the spiritual rebels in the heavenly realm. That's good news. Strange news, but good news. He's waiting to devour the child. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Who is this child? It's Jesus. In fact, John, he's taking us where? That's a direct quote from Psalm 2, which I walked us through a few weeks ago. It's a messianic psalm. What's it say? He says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me. I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. John says, when this sign happened in the sky, it announced the birth of the one who has come to rule the nations with a rod of iron in his hand. This is clearly the announcement of the Messiah. This is the announcement of the birth of Jesus. And if y'all would let me, I could spend another hour and a half. I spent a lot more time walking through Revelation 12 there and some of the details. And I was talking with Wanda about it the other night. I think maybe next year I'll do maybe a little seminar, because I'll need like 3 hours. I'll need like 3 hours to kind of, because I've been nerding out the last couple weeks. I think it's been awesome. But what does this mean? What's the meaning of this beyond just the stuff happening in the sky? You know, the Jewish context of this. So the Jews at the time of Jesus, the Jews at the time of John, when they hear them describe this, and they knew the movement of the stars way better than we do. Like, it was a big part of their life. So when they read Revelation, they knew what he was talking about. They knew what the sign was. They would easily interpret this. And they could do the math and figure out what day he was talking about. As I already mentioned, the date that this sign appears in the sky is September 11th, 3 BC. Now, that September 11th date, that means something different for us now than it did a couple of decades ago, doesn't it? It meant something incredibly different to the Jews of Jesus' day. Now, if you may not know, but the Jewish calendar is a little different than our calendar. And it has, I mean, it's a lunar calendar as well, but it has a different start. It has a different end. So what is September 11th, 3 BC on the Jewish calendar? I thought maybe we'd have an expert here. Only one nerd in the room. All right. In the Jewish calendar, I love you, Kelly. In the Jewish calendar, September 11th, 3 BC, was Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the Jewish New Year. It was Tishri 1, the Day of Trumpets. Oh. Now, you want to go spend some time, go back from Revelation 12, read the end of Revelation 11, and the blowing of the trumpet, the announcement, the revelation of the altar and the ark, and the when the sign comes in the heavens, God is revealing. Oh, Tishri 1. Tishri 1, the beginning of the Jewish New Year, was considered by the ancient Jews to be the first day of creation. So Tishri 1 is associated with creation. It's the It's the day of renewal. It's the day of birth. All the ancient kings, they would track their inauguration to Tishri 1. Didn't matter when they actually started their reign. Because the inauguration of a king had to happen on Tishri 1. Had to be the beginning of the year. Had to be the day of creation. And so Tishri 1, for the Jewish people and the Jewish is the day of creation. It's the day of the inauguration of a king. Is there any other day that Jesus should have been born on? So they hear the sign, they read the sign. Now, understand, this is not prophecy. Right? This is not a prophecy hundreds of years in the past that then takes place in the future. This is a reading of the sign actually after the fact. John in Revelation is describing what happened when Jesus was born some almost 40, maybe 50 years ahead. He's looking back. So listen, don't get sucked into those crazy television and internet preachers. They're going to take Revelation and take Revelation 12, and there's lots of these guys out there. And they're going to take Revelation 12, and they're going to try to track the stars, and they say, this is going to tell us when Jesus is coming back. No, it's not. That's not what it's telling us. It's telling us when Jesus came the first time. It's telling us about it after the fact. It's not prophetic. It's not God announcing what's going to happen in the future. God's describing what's happening in the present through the star. Forgive the tangent. Those scary television preachers make me so mad. All they want is your money. Jesus being born on Tishri 1 is a sign that he is indeed the new Adam. He has come to redeem us from the first fall, the fall of mankind. But wait, there's more. Tishri 1 was also known as the birth date of Noah. And we can read through Genesis 6 and 7 and 8. We can track Noah's life. It becomes pretty clear that he was born on Tishri 1. Now, what's that narrative about? You remember Genesis 6, that weird chapter about the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, who look and see the women are beautiful, and they come and take them, and they produce this strange offspring, the Nephilim. Genesis 6 is a story of a fall. It's a spiritual fall, the fall of the heavens. And who does God use to deliver mankind from the fall of the spiritual beings? He uses Noah. Preserves him in an ark, takes him through the waters of chaos and the flood, and delivers him to dry and safe land. Noah was born on Tishri 1 in the midst of a spiritual fall. And so when Jesus is born on Tishri 1, he's not only the new Adam who comes to save us from the fall of Genesis chapter 3, he's the one who comes as the new Noah who saves us from the spiritual rebellion of Genesis chapter 6. Jesus is the one that saves us from it all. That's cool. I don't care who you are. That's cool. That's amazing. Like there's so much beauty in the planning and the arranging and the orchestrating of God. Like God could have had him be born on any day, but he had him be born on that day to communicate to us that God is working on our behalf in ways that we can't even imagine. And if God put that much precision and that much planning and that much orchestration into the first coming of Jesus, can we not have incredible confidence that he will be coming again? Right? Like that God's movement, God's act of power on our behalf is not done. That the birth of Jesus was awesome. Like it was awesome. Denny started today by saying it was the best day ever. I think that depends on how we define best. Because I think the best is yet to come. Like, I love that Jesus was born, and I love that Jesus grew, and I love that Jesus died, and I love that Jesus rose from the dead, and I love that Jesus ascended to his throne in the heavens. But I can't wait for the true advent, the final advent, when heaven and earth are fully reconciled. When we get to hear his voice from the throne declare, "Behold, I have made all things new." I can't wait for the second coming of Jesus. I can't wait till the words of Revelation 22 is fulfilled. "Behold," Jesus says, "I am coming soon." Now, God reckons soon a little bit differently than you and I do. But behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me, to repay each one for what he has done. For I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. That's who we celebrate at Christmas. 8-pound, 7-ounce baby Jesus is the lamb from the foundation of the world, offered for our sin. And he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And what he has started, he will finish. So we celebrate Advent with both a past orientation and a future orientation. Because he came once. We celebrate it December 25th, and that's all right, because the day doesn't matter. What we're celebrating is that he came. And what we're celebrating is that he will come again. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.